welcome. You're here now, so close your eyes if you'd like. Let the modern world slip off like a too tight corset. We're going somewhere quieter, older and slower. No screens, no neon, just the steady creak of timber above your head and a heavy smell of rushes on the floor. Tonight, we're sinking into the soft folds of medieval Europe, where sex was not quite what you think, where what happened beneath the blanket saw more often, on straw pallets, beside fireplaces, or in creaking stables, was shaped not just by desire, but by God, fear, neighbors, and at least one suspiciously suggestive onion pop. Sex, in the Middle Ages, did not belong to the people who had it. It belonged to the church, the courts, the healers, the gossips, and occasionally the saints. To understand medieval intimacy is to understand a world where bodies were always being watched, if not by your spouse or priest, then by your ancestors, your unborn children, or the local midwife with an excellent memory and an even better relationship with the village scribe. Even in private moments, someone was peeking in metaphorically or otherwise. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin gently. In this long and dusty story, let's start by asking the simplest question. What did sex mean to the medieval mind? The answer is not anatomical. It was theological, spiritual, transactional. Sex was a tool, a danger, a prayer, and sometimes an inconvenience. It was rarely just pleasure. The act of coupling had implications far beyond the bedroom. It could mean babies, or sin, or inheritance dispute, or the plague. It could summon demons or cure melancholy. It could ruin your reputation or fix your soul. The body was never just a body. It was a moral landscape. For the church, sex was something to fear and manage. It had rules, so many rules. When to do it, how to do it, and who could be in the room while it happened. Monks and priests debated how many thrusts were too many, whether thinking about it counted, whether dreaming about it was worse. There were guides, manuals, sin tallies, whole calendars of forbidden days. Wednesdays and Fridays were bad. Advent and Lent were worse. If you obeyed the calendar, there were maybe 100 days left in the year when married couples could technically fulfill their duty without incurring divine disapproval. Not that anyone actually followed it, but the guilt was free and available on request. Outside the cloisters, things were no less complicated. Folk beliefs layered over church teachings like a second, slightly stickier skin. Villagers whispered about fertility spirits and buried phallic amulets under their thresholds. There were charms to increase desire and charms to ward it off. There were herbs to encourage conception and others to prevent it. There were songs sung over soup, and knots tied in hair, and rituals involving sheep's intestines and rainwater, and prayers to saints, who had never officially endorsed such behavior, but were too dead to protest. And then there were the onions. Onions? Yes, they show up again and again in medieval remedies, especially those related to love and sex. Soaked in wine, stuffed into orifices we won't name just yet. Onions were considered warming, moistening, stimulating. They were also cheap and widely available, which made them the medieval aphrodisiac of choice, albeit one with unfortunate, breath-related consequences. One 14th-century remedy suggested mixing onion juice with honey and a bit of pig's fat to awaken flagging male desire. Whether it worked is debatable. Whether it impressed one's partner is unlikely, but onions were just the beginning. As we continue our story, we'll meet many other medieval bedroom companions. Fennel, pennyroyal leeches, vinegar, goose fat, iron rods, rosemary, and beeswax. The bedroom was not a soft and perfumed boudoir. It was a place of practical magic, an experimental theatre of folk science and theological dread. What's curious is how much of this got recorded. You might imagine that medieval sex was secret, hidden, quietly endured, and quickly forgotten. But no, it was documented with alarming enthusiasm. Priests kept confession records, midwives kept birthing notes, court scribes wrote down every whispered accusation about who was caught with whom behind the alehouse. And when neighbors reported each other for adultery, fornication, or general lewdness, the details were included. So we know. We know about the miller's daughter who climbed through a window, the monk who couldn't keep his vows, the butcher who visited the same prostitute every Tuesday. Their names are faded now, but their stories survive embedded in parchment, like fingerprints left in wax. Sex was regulated not just by religion, but by law. In many towns, there were official ordinances about when and how it was allowed. In Florence, brothels were state. In London, prostitutes were required to wear a striped hood. In Paris, public kissing could be fined. And in some corners of the Holy Roman Empire, men were required to obtain a wife's consent before engaging in marital intercourse, at least during pregnancy or fasting days. Consent, in these cases, was less about bodily autonomy and more about avoiding bad luck or malformed babies, but still, it was written down. Even furniture got involved. There were marriage beds, consecrated and inspected, bed frames that belonged to the church, rented out to newlyweds like sacred scaffolding. Beds were not private, they were political. Witnesses were often present at weddings to ensure the couple went to bed. Sometimes those witnesses stayed, just to make sure the union was consummated. Imagine your uncle sitting at the foot of the bed on your wedding night, praying and watching. Now imagine that being considered romantic. But despite all this scrutiny, or perhaps because of it, sex found its own strange rhythm in medieval life. It lived in the pauses, in the rituals, in the borrowed rooms and early morning hours. It shaped jokes and dreams and inheritance laws. It was whispered about, punished, forgiven, and whispered about again. The church feared it. The folk world embraced it. Medicine tried to explain it, and ordinary people simply lived with it. Sometimes badly, sometimes beautifully. This series will take you through that world slowly, piece by piece. We'll explore the church's tangled doctrines. We'll meet medieval physicians and their moistening ointments. We'll watch people sneak behind barns and confess to the wrong priest. We'll stand in courtrooms as peasants explain, with astonishing specificity, why they believe their neighbor is an adulterer. We'll eavesdrop on troubadour songs and read the marginalia scribbled by monks who should have known better. We'll open jars of old herbs And guess what? They were meant to prevent. And we, look carefully at the many ways medieval people tried to make sense of desire without losing their souls or their social standing in the process. There will be no judgment here, only curiosity and a bit of candlelight. If your modern mind finds itself puzzled by what was once considered sinful or sacred, that's all right. History is a strange mirror. Sometimes it distorts, sometimes it clarifies. Mostly, it reminds us that people have always been awkward and hopeful and occasionally ridiculous. So rest now. Not sleep. Not yet. Just rest. Let the pages open. Let the blankets of time settle over your shoulders. Let your breath match the rhythm of the turning wheel, the rustling parchment, the soft sound of linen being folded in a room where no one is supposed to be. We are only beginning. When you're ready, we'll slip into the next chamber of this long, slow house. The one where church bells ring and bishops frown and someone is definitely doing something they shouldn't behind a tapestry. And yes, there will be more onions. So, you've wandered deeper into the medieval home, past the rustling linen and creaking stairs, and now you find yourself beneath the vaulted hush of the church. But not the grand kind with stained glass and echoing choirs. No, this is the intimate church, the one folded into the corner of your room, the one that peers between your sheets, that listens at the door, that keeps a ledger in the vestry and a sin chart just for your bedroom behavior. Welcome to the sacred tangle of ecclesiastical rules and celestial shame. Here, sex was not private, it was scheduled. You might have imagined that once two people were legally and sacramentally wed, the church would allow them a little peace, a bit of bliss, a break from judgment. But no, marriage did not unlock freedom. It unlocked paperwork. The church, ever vigilant, declared that even married sex could be sinful. In fact, it often was, because while marriage was a sacred bond, desire was not. And so the church issued a series of rules, not just about who you could sleep with, but when and how and for what purpose. If your motives were wrong, your posture was rebellious, or the liturgical calendar wasn't aligned, you might find your soul quietly sliding toward damnation despite your best intentions. Let's begin with the calendar. It may surprise you to learn that the majority of days in the medieval year were officially marked as unsuitable for intercourse. The Church prohibited sex during Advent, Lent, the 12 days of Christmas, the 40 days after Easter, the eves of feast days, the days of fasting, the night before receiving communion, and of course, Sundays. Add it all up and you're left with about 100 permissible nights a year. On the remaining 265, touching your spouse might doom your soul. Not that people were always counting, but the implication hung thick in the air. Guilt, like wood smoke, settled in every corner. And then there were the positions. Yes, positions. Medieval clerics, despite their vows of chastity, spent a surprising amount of time cataloguing and condemning physical arrangements of the conjugal act. The only acceptable form, they said, was the one mirroring the natural order, man on top facing the heavens. Anything else, sideways, seated, standing, or involving mirrors was discouraged. or outright banned. Pleasure that seemed too clever, too creative, or too joyful was often suspect. Even the act of enjoying sex too much with one's own spouse could be considered a venial sin. Too much lust, even within the walls of wedlock, was like smuggling firewood into hell and lighting it yourself. If all this sounds exhausting, consider the clerics themselves. These were men trained in logic, argument, and divine law. Many of them, never married, never touched, never tempted, were still expected to give advice to parishioners struggling with matters of the flesh. So they wrote pages and pages, guides and warnings, whole manuals. The most famous of these was the penitential sort of spiritual accounting book for It included lengthy sections about sexual acts, ranked by severity, and laid out the appropriate penance. A kiss could earn you a few days of fasting. Full intercourse on a feast day might cost you months of penance. Non-procreative acts could sentence you to spiritual exile. If you're a particularly creative couple, you might find yourselves in a category with no precedent, at which point the confessor might consult a bishop or simply make something up and hope God agreed. Nocturnal emissions, for instance, were a special concern. Men who experienced them, especially clerics, were expected to confess. These involuntary nighttime episodes were interpreted not as neutral bodily functions, but as signs of impure thoughts or demonic influence. Some monks tried to stay awake at night, hoping to avoid them. Others whipped themselves before bed. Some fasted, slept on cold stone, or tied cords around their thighs. The body was an enemy, and sleep was a battlefield. Married women, too, were not exempt. They were expected to submit. Yes, but also to monitor their intentions. If a woman demanded sex, she risked being labeled lascivious. If she resisted too often, she could be accused of sinning by denying her husband his conjugal rights. Pleasure for women was allowed only as a consequence of obedience. Desire was tolerated if it was quiet, reluctant, and preferably brief. A woman who enjoyed sex too much was compared to Eve. Or worse, a woman who didn't enjoy it enough might be accused of having a withered womb or cold blood. And then there was the infamous sin chart. Compiled by confessors, these documents listed sexual acts and assigned them specific punishments. Oral acts, manual assistance, or anything involving more than two bodies were considered mortal sins. Even within marriage, any act not directly oriented toward procreation was discouraged. These sin charts weren't just for priests. In some towns, they were read aloud during Lenten sermons. Imagine sitting in a cold church while the priest explains in Latin and then again in the vernacular why having sex on Saturday while standing up might condemn you to hell unless you abstained from butter for the next 6 months. And yet, for all the rules, people continued to live. They whispered, laughed, ignored, and occasionally confessed. The church's reach was long, but not always precise. Many rural areas were too far from bishops, too short on priests, or too busy with ploughing and baking to observe every restriction. Folk customs continued. Songs were sung, beds were shared, and in private, behind shuttered windows, people navigated the space between shame and satisfaction with as much grace as they could manage. clergy themselves were not immune. While the official position was celibacy, many priests kept concubines, quietly fathered children, or confessed to struggling with temptation. Monasteries sometimes became places of whispered scandal. Abbots wrote letters to Rome asking what to do when half their monks were caught sneaking out at night. Pope Gregory and others responded with varying degrees of severity. Sometimes they issued strict penalties. Sometimes they recommended more prayer. Occasionally, they did nothing. The bureaucracy of sin moved slowly. Even the architecture of the church bore witness to these contradictions. Sculptures on cathedral walls sometimes included lewd or bawdy figures, tucked among saints and angels. Some scholars believe these were warnings, visual reminders of the dangers of lust. Others think they were jokes. Either way, they remind us that even in the holiest places, desire left its mark. And so we continue, stumbling forward through this dense fog of spiritual concern and bodily need. The medieval church, for all its seriousness, was still a deeply human institution. It tried to legislate sex with the precision of a celestial accountant, but it could not erase the impulse itself. Beneath the robes and relics and ringing bells, there remained the same heartbeat, the same warmth, the same awkward longing. Next, we will turn to the body as a medical mystery. The medieval physician believed that love could be diagnosed, that semen could rot, that women's wombs could wander if neglected, and that sex, when properly administered, might actually restore balance to the body's humors. Strange advice, perhaps, but no stranger than sin charts. For now, step quietly from the chapel. Shake the incense from your hair. The confession booth is empty. The candles are low. The guilt can wait. There's more to explore. And now we step gently from the cathedral into the bedroom, or what passed for a bedroom in medieval Europe, a room with no privacy, a bed made of ropes and straw, possibly a goat in the corner, and two people who may or may not have met before this very moment, now bound in holy matrimony, and about to perform what the church would delicately refer to as their marital duty. Welcome to the strange, flickering space where love, law, and linen collided, where marriage was less about romance and more about property, alliances, and managing how and when one was expected to lie back and think of salvation. Marriage in medieval Europe was not, first and foremost, about affection. It was a contract, a binding, legal, social, and often financial arrangement negotiated between families, especially among the landowning or upwardly mobile. A marriage was more transaction than love story. A daughter's hand was traded for land, coin, or political leverage. A son's prospects depended on what kind of dowry he could secure. And while the church insisted that both parties consent to the union, consent could be as thin as a nod, sometimes not even that. If you had reached puberty and your parents had signed the agreement, congratulations, were now someone's lawful spouse, whether or not you could spell it. The dowry was central. It wasn't just a gift. It was a guarantee, a payment made by the bride's family to ensure she'd be properly kept, or at least tolerated. Sometimes it included money, sometimes linens, sometimes livestock, or, in more ambitious negotiations, a vineyard, The husband, in return, was expected to provide a mourning gift, a token of appreciation, the day after the wedding night. Yes, this was a real thing, a gift presented after consummation, assuming the act had occurred and no one had fainted or been too distracted by the hymns, which brings us to the curious matter of consummation. A marriage wasn't truly sealed until it had been physically enacted. And just to ensure there were no doubts, medieval Europe developed the fine tradition of the bedding ceremony. This was not optional. Witnesses, often family members, sometimes village elders, occasionally the local priest, would escort the newlyweds to bed. They would help undress them, say a prayer, and then leave. In theory, in practice, some witnesses stayed, just in case, to make sure the couple got started. Imagine being 16, nervous, possibly drunk on bad ale, and having your mother-in-law at the foot of the bed, reminding you to honor your vows and be quick about it. This was intimacy as public event, and shame was built into the curtains. Once married, sex was expected regularly. The church encouraged it as part of a couple's spiritual obligation. Too little sex, they warned, could lead to temptation, adultery, or, worse, complaints to the bishop. But how often was often enough? That, too, was debated. Some clerics suggested twice a week. Others thought once a month was sufficient. Marital frequency charts were drafted, sign tallies were updated, and eventually the question settled into that familiar medieval rhythm. Do it, but not too often. Not on feast days, not on fast days, and certainly not while enjoying it. Still, spouses did try to negotiate their way through the darkness. There were nights when one partner was tired, or pregnant, or suspicious that too much pleasure would summon spiritual ruin. A wife might refuse, a husband might complain. In some places, refusal could lead to a legal case. Husbands could appeal to church courts claiming their wives were denying them access. Wives, in turn, could sometimes claim their husbands were neglecting them. It was a delicate dance, argued in Latin by men in robes who had not touched a woman since their training, and who believed lust began in the liver and ended in a heresy trial. But even within the rules, there was room for strange tenderness. Marriages evolved. Some couples grew fond of each other. Some fell in love long after the documents were signed. Others remained politely distant, performing their duties with the grim efficiency of tax collection. And some avoided each other altogether. In wealthier households, separate beds were not uncommon. In peasant homes, where the entire family might sleep in one room, avoidance required more creativity. Sometimes it involved pretending to be asleep. Sometimes it involved a strategically timed visit to the neighbor's goats. Then there were animals. If a couple failed to consummate their marriage, they could apply to have it dissolved. Courts would ask intimate questions. Medical exams were performed. Witnesses might testify. One famous case involved a man who claimed his wife had bewitched his genitals, rendering him incapable of fulfilling his role. The court summoned local healers. A priest was called to test for enchantment. It was eventually concluded that the man was simply nervous and possibly drunk. The marriage remained valid. Virginity, of course, was prized. At least for women, proof of a bride's chastity was often demanded, sometimes in the form of a bloodied sheet shown to relatives after the wedding night, sometimes through whispered testimony. A woman who failed to bleed might be accused of deception, or witchcraft, or worse, previous enjoyment. Midwives were sometimes employed to examine brides. Remedies were sold to fake the signs of virginity. Vinegar, chicken, blood, ground chalk. The pressure was high, the margin for error dangerously thin. But for all the drama, the medieval marriage bed was also just part of life. It creaked, it shifted, it made room for children. It was swept and repaired. It was shared with infants, and sometimes pets, and occasionally guests. The idea of the bed as a sacred private space was still forming. It was furniture, yes, but also a place of duty, transaction, and awkward silences. People lived there, in those arrangements, not always happily, but with a kind of resigned persistence. When wives said no, they were rarely believed. Marital rape, though unnamed, was not recognized as a crime. The body of a wife was understood as part of the marital contract. Her availability was assumed. Her resistance interpreted as spiritual weakness, or hysteria, or disobedience. Some women found ways to say no quietly. With headaches, with rituals, with long visits to relatives, but legally, the Church leaned heavily toward the husband's rights. Only in rare case, as when abuse was extreme or impotence provable, did wives receive any meaningful support. Mostly, they endured or negotiated or plotted their revenge in whispered alliances at the market. The idea of consent, as we understand it now, was not yet born. But it stirred, in poems, in letters, in rare legal cases where a woman's voice was heard and heeded. These were faint flickers in a dark room, but they mattered. They remind us that even in a world shaped by obligation and oversight, desire still whispered, and tenderness still found a way in. As we leave the marital bed rumpled, regulated, and reluctantly shed, we move next to those who lay outside it entirely, the women who were paid. The brothels licensed by city councils, the sex workers who knew the rules better than the priests and still broke them with style. We are heading toward lace curtains, government-approved sin, and the occasional goat-themed municipal tax. But for now, draw the curtain. Fluff the straw. The wedding guests have gone. The witnesses are asleep, and the bed, however narrow, still holds a story. The bed is quiet now. The guests have gone. The priest has offered his final blessing. The sheets, however, remain, and in many homes those sheets are not merely linens. They are evidence, proof, testimony, a blood-stained cloth folded and displayed like a holy relic, not for the sake of medical interest or even gossip, but as assurance that what was purchased was, in fact, unopened. We are speaking, of course, of virginity, a concept that was, in medieval Europe, not just personal but political, sacred, economically valuable, and for many girls, unbearably dangerous. To be untouched was to hold currency. Noble families built entire strategies around it. A daughter's virginity was not merely a point of honor. It was a selling point. a guarantee, a promise of unspoiled lineage. Her body was a vault, and its contents were assumed to be sealed until marriage. Whether she wished it or not, whether she understood what that sealing entailed or not, her purity was not hers. It was loaned to her by the expectations of those around her, and withdrawn the moment she misstepped or the moment someone else decided to step where he was not invited. There were tests, crude ones, cruel ones. A lack of blood on the wedding sheets could be enough to start rumors, annulments, even accusations of sorcery. If the bride did not bleed, she was suspect. Perhaps she was already deflowered. Perhaps she was not a woman at all. Perhaps she was unnatural. The logic was circular and unforgiving, and so many girls, terrified of the possibility of failure, turned to folklore and desperate remedies. There were powders sold by travelling women, said to mimic the flush of first intercourse, a mix of chalk, animal blood, and crushed berries, dabbed discreetly on the sheets before dawn. There were vinegar douches, said to tighten what needed to appear tight. There were talismans, charms, whispered prayers to St. Agnes and St. Catherine, who had supposedly guarded their own chastity so fiercely that they could lend a little protection to others. Whether these rituals worked was beside the point. The belief mattered more than the biology. Of course, not all virginity was treated equally. The Virgin Mary loomed large over the medieval imagination, a figure both divine and unreachable. She had birthed a child without ever being touched, which made her the ultimate symbol of purity and the most impossible model for any living woman. Her cult grew rapidly across Europe. Cathedrals bore her name. Songs praised her. Painters depicted her with lilies, symbols of her unspoiled nature. And beneath it all, ordinary girls were measured against her impossible standard. A village girl who kissed the wrong boy behind the grain shed could find herself shunned. If she was lucky, she might be married off quickly. The timing blurred with a bit of creative counting. If she was unlucky, she might be sent to a convent, or worse, left to wander, marked by gossip, with her family's prospects quietly collapsing behind her. Boys, of course, were rarely punished the same way. A bit of wandering lust in a man was excused. In a woman, it was seen as a symptom of a deeper rot, a crack in her moral structure, a dangerous hunger. Some families went further. Noble girls were sometimes examined by midwives to confirm their physical status. These women, experienced in childbirth and female anatomy, were expected to identify signs of prior intimacy, a stretch of tissue, a looseness, a posture. Of course, these methods were deeply flawed. The so-called virginity test has no real scientific basis. But science was not the goal. Reassurance was. Performance was. In this world, proof was whatever could be believed by enough people with enough power. Chastity belts, contrary to popular myth, were rarely used in reality. The few that survive are more likely symbolic or theatrical than functional, but the idea of them tells us much about the culture. A locked body, a sealed gate, a father holding the key. The metaphor lingered, even if the hardware didn't, and it told girls something very clearly. You were meant to be protected, and if you failed to protect yourself, you deserved the consequences. But virginity wasn't just a pre-marriage concern. In religious communities, it became a permanent vocation. Nuns were considered the brides of Christ, their physical untouchedness seen as a direct offering to the divine. Some women chose this life freely, desiring spiritual focus. Others were placed there by families, unable or unwilling to marry them off. Either way, their virginity became institutional, celebrated, guarded. Bones, even supposed drops of blood, were preserved and worshipped. Purity was currency in heaven, too. This obsession with the untouched female body bled into every corner of society. In literature, the noble maiden is always chaste. The heroine is pure. The witch, the temptress, the widow, these are the spoiled, the dangerous, the ones who know too much. Virginity was not just about biology. It was about narrative. A woman's story could begin in innocence, but only if she remained unspoiled. Otherwise, she was already halfway to her fall. And yet, people are people. They fell in love. They wandered into barns after dark. They trusted boys who promised to marry them and disappeared. And for some girls, that first stumble became a kind of trap. Pregnancies outside of marriage were deeply scandalous. Options were few. Some sought herbs and midwives to end the pregnancy. Others fled. Some were forced to marry their seducers. Others were whipped in public or made to wear shame garments, rough linen marked with symbolic stains to mass. But even in this world of control and fear, there were those who resisted. Girls who lied boldly, who carried false tokens of virginity, who laughed behind closed shutters, who scribbled poems in the margins of books, confessing to nothing and everything at once. One anonymous writer penned this in the corner of a parchment: "I was a girl, then I loved. Now I am just that. No shame, no apology, a quiet defiance beneath layers of expected silence." Economically, virginity affected not just dowries but inheritance. A child born of an impure union could be declared illegitimate and barred from inheriting property or title. This made a woman's body a legal threat, a sealed vault whose breach could topple families. No wonder fathers guarded daughters so fiercely. No wonder some women vanished from records the moment rumors surfaced. To protect a name was sometimes to erase a person. And yet, purity was a myth that even those enforcing it couldn't fully believe. Priests heard confessions that undermined every rule. Midwives saw bodies that didn't conform to any legend. Older women whispered truths in kitchens and bathhouses that virginity was not a line but a blur, that it could be faked, that it might return, that it didn't matter, not really. Not if you survived, not if you could feed yourself, not if you loved, even once. So we leave this chamber now, quiet and chilled. The sheets are folded, the stories remain. Virginity, in the medieval mind, was a kind of currency no one could fully spend, and no one could ever get back. A fiction made real by pressure, by fear, by 1,000 whispered lies passed from mother to daughter. It was never fair, it was rarely kind, and it left a trail of girls behind it, some married, some vanished, some standing quietly in windows with too many thoughts and not enough words. Next, We will step into the world of those who broke all the rules and got paid for it. The red-lit districts, the state-sanctioned brothels, the women who made their living in defiance of purity, and sometimes, just sometimes, wrote the rules themselves. But for now, let the shutters close. Let the linen settle. The myths will still be there in the morning. The shutters are drawn now. The candles are low. The linen no longer asks questions. And beyond the walls of confession, ceremony, and coin, another kind of bed begins to breathe. Not the marital bed, with its rules and its witnesses, but the secret one, the whispered one, the one made not of law but of longing, because no matter how tightly the church grasped the script, people still loved, they still lusted, they still reached for each other in the dark with hands that didn't ask permission. And across medieval Europe, beneath the weight of dogma and duty, the forbidden bed remained warm. Adultery was not just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Legally, spiritually, publicly. For women, especially, the risks were heavy. A wife caught in the arms of another man might be shorn, paraded through the streets, or imprisoned. In some places, she could be legally beaten. In others, fined. A few found themselves locked in chastity garb by vengeful husband symbols, more than punishment, but humiliating nonetheless. Men, by contrast, faced fewer consequences unless the affair threatened property or politics. A nobleman seducing a peasant's wife might be forgiven, but a knight caught bedding the queen, that was treason. Still, people strayed. Of course, they did. Marriage was rarely chosen. Desire was rarely patient. And the flesh, even when wrapped in prayer, still pulsed beneath its silks and tunics. Affairs bloomed in castle corridors, behind monastery walls, between merchant stalls and shadowed corners of chapels. Sometimes they began in silence, with glances over candlelight, sometimes with the brush of a hand at the market, sometimes with poetry, folded and left under pillows, a verse about longing, a line about the curve of a shoulder, nothing explicit. Of course, just enough to start a fire. In noble courts, affairs often had political consequences. Queens sometimes took lovers. Nobles maneuvered themselves closer to power through intimacy. But for those billow maids, monks, scribes, the stakes were often more private. A forbidden tryst could lead to exile. A pregnancy could ruin a life. And yet, behind closed doors, they met in kitchens, in stables, in chapel cloisters, with thick stone walls and the occasional unlocked vestry. Passion was messy. It didn't care for hierarchy. It didn't pause to check calendars or consult theology. It simply arrived, often uninvited, and refused to leave. Monasteries, too, were not immune. Cloistered life was meant to be chaste, removed, elevated. But human hearts don't always follow that. Letters survive, from monks confessing to curses, exchanged under candlelight. Nuns scribbled poems in the margins of psalters, verses that rhymed with yearning more than piety. There are stories of young novices caught in haylofts, of abbots sneaking across gardens at night. One Benedictine chronicle mentions a scandal in which an entire convent was discovered to be holding nighttime meetings with a neighboring order of monks, under the guise of shared prayer. The bishop apparently was not amused. Some of these stories come to us through court records, not because they were common knowledge, but because they were caught. A woman pregnant outside of marriage, a monk accused by another of breaking vows, a love letter intercepted by a suspicious husband. The records are often clinical, but the traces of feeling still leak through. A man writes of his sweet companion of the garden hour. A woman refers to a lover as her breath between bells. Language becomes veil. Emotion becomes evidence. Same-gender love, too, lived in these spaces, quietly, carefully. The church condemned it. The law often followed suit. Sodomy was punishable by death in some places, by exile in others. But desire finds language even when forbidden. Letters between men survive, filled with coded longing. A knight refers to his companion as my mirror, my moon. Female saints were described with such intimate admiration by their followers that modern scholars pause. Some friendships were likely just that devout and affectionate. Others may have been more. And in some monasteries, silence became a kind of protection. If no one spoke it, perhaps it didn't count. Symbols helped. A shared token, a flower placed on a windowsill. In certain circles, the color blue, the iris, or the clasped hand became shorthand. Not everyone noticed, not everyone needed to. In a world where open confession could destroy you, subtext was a survival skill. And for those who loved in secret, every gesture was both risk and reward. Love spells were another path. The belief in charms and magic was strong. People visited cunning women and herb sellers to request potions, elixirs, and powders to stir the heart of an unyielding beloved. These spells varied by region, but many involved bodily substance, fennel or mugwort. Some were designed to be eaten, others worn. A woman might steep her undergarments in a potion and hang them near a man's bed. A man might bury a charm beneath the home of a widow he admired. Not all of it worked. Most of it didn't. But hope is stubborn, and so are hormones. Pregnancies, of course, complicated everything. A noble woman could hide one, perhaps for a while. Servants knew how to adjust gowns. Midwives could be sworn to silence. But among the lower classes, the signs were harder to disguise. Unwed mothers faced public penance, fines, labor in workhouses. Some fled to distant towns. Others turned to herbs again, this time for stronger remedies. Rue, penny, dangerous plants with a double-edged promise. Abortions were illegal, but they happened in hushed kitchens, in woods, at dusk, at the hands of women who knew what to do, but also how it could go wrong. And yet, even in risk, there was joy. Forbidden lovers still found moments of wonder. A kiss stolen during a hand brushed beneath a festival tent. Lovers met in fields, in barns, in rented rooms above taverns, and sometimes they stayed. A scandal faded. A family relented. A child was raised quietly. Not every story ended in punishment. Some simply carried on unnoticed, like ivy growing between stones. Literature preserved these moments, too. Courtly love poems celebrated longing from afar, but bawdier tales slipped in sideward. The fabliaux short comic stories from France often featured lovers tricking priests, husbands, or each other. In one, a woman hides her lover in a barrel. In another, a young man poses as a statue to sneak into a bath. These were not just entertainment. They were cultural confession, a recognition that desire doesn't obey instruction. And the Church, for all its condemnation, knew this. It continued to preach chastity, to punish where it could, to issue warnings and fines and sermons full of brimstone, but it also understood that the heart, like the body, could not always be tamed, so it leaned harder into penance. Confession booths stayed busy. Priests listened patiently or impatiently as villagers described dreams they wished they hadn't had. Some wept, some laughed, most returned to the same pews. The next week, no purer but slightly lighter. The forbidden bed, then, was not just a place of danger. It was a place of life, of complexity, of truth that couldn't be said out loud but needed saying somehow. It held passion and fear, joy and guilt. It belonged to the quiet rebellion of being human in a world that demanded saints. And in that space, tucked between law and lust, people lived anyway. We leave now, not with judgment, but with understanding. The night is still thick with secrets. The curtains still shift, and the stories still breathed, tucked into the corners of court records and forgotten poems. Next, we will wander into the realm of control once more, to the brothels and alleyways, where love became labor, where touching was taxed, and where pleasure wore a price tag. Now we come to the part of the city lit in red. Not in neon, of course, but by the flickering shadows of oil lamps, and the blush of secrets left too close to the windows. The places where pleasure had a price, morality was measured by taxes, and the Church politely looked the other way unless someone forgot to pay their dues. This is the world of medieval brothels. Places forbidden in word but necessary in practice, tolerated, regulated, even sponsored by the same authorities that condemned them from the pulpit. A strange dance of denial and indulgence that made up the rhythm of life behind the velvet curtain. Most major cities in medieval Europe had brothels, not hidden dens of vice tucked in back alleys, but public, recognized establishments, often given their own districts and allowed to operate openly so long as the rules were followed. In London, Southwark was known for its stew houses, so named, not for their cuisine but for their warm baths, which sometimes led to warmer conversations. In Paris, the Rue Gravois hummed with nightly traffic. In Florence, Venice, Kalanick had their zones, their schedules, their taxes, and those taxes were not symbolic, they were collected. Carefully, the Church, for all its pronouncements on chastity and sin, quietly tolerated sex work. St. Augustine himself had warned that removing prostitutes from society would cause greater chaos, likening their presence to the sewer system of a city, necessary, unpleasant, but essential for the health of the whole. That logic lingered. City officials understood that unregulated desire could lead to far worse assaults, illegitimate births, noble scandals. Better, They reasoned to contain it, to manage it, to make it predictable, so the brothels stayed license, inspected, official. The women who worked in them were not free, but they were not entirely helpless either. Some were trafficked or coerced, others came voluntarily, often out of economic desperation. A widow with no inheritance, a peasant girl with no dowry, a runaway nun who had tasted the forbidden and decided not to return. They entered with different stories, but once inside, the rules were the same. They paid rent. They were subject to curfews. They were expected to maintain hygiene and obey the madam or keeper who ran the house. The brothel keeper was often a woman, sometimes a former courtesan herself, sometimes a business-minded widow. Her job was part accountant, part disciplinarian, part diplomat. She negotiated with city officials. She managed the books. She ensured the girls did not drink too much or leave without permission. She might also be the only protection they had against violent clients, venereal disease, or drunken knights who arrived after a failed tournament and thought themselves gods. Clients came from every social class. Apprentices saving wages, merchants passing through, priests quietly after sundown, nobles in masks, husbands who whispered lies about business trips. The brothels knew them all. Some men had favorites and returned regularly. Others came in groups and treated the experience like a feast, complete with food, wine, and lewd jokes. Payment varied. Coin, of course, but sometimes jewelry or clothing. There are records of women receiving rabbits, shoes, even small plots of land in exchange for their services. The exchange was flexible. The expectations were not. Medical inspections became standard in many cities. Women were required to undergo periodic examinations to check for signs of disease. These were not discreet affairs. A city-appointed doctor or barber surgeon would visit, often accompanied by officials, and examine the women with no regard for privacy or consent. The process was invasive, humiliating, and entirely one-sided. Clients were never examined, only the women. If disease was found, they might be temporarily removed from service, locked in a healing ward, or fined. Treatment was primitive at best. Mercury baths, cauterization, herbal poultices that did little more than sting. Many simply endured, or pretended. Despite their social role, sex workers were not granted status. They were not invited to feast days. They could not marry freely. Their children, if acknowledged, were often barred from inheritance. Yet they lived. They carved out communities. They formed alliances. In some cities, brothel workers marched in carnival parades with their own symbols and songs. In others, they maintained altars to patron saints Mary Magdalene, naturally, and occasionally St. Nicholas, for reasons no one quite explained. Some brothels were located shockingly close to religious institutions. In certain cities, a red light district could sit just a few steps from a cathedral. One French town placed its largest brothel directly beside a bishop's palace. The bishop objected loudly. The city ignored him. Another town built its church bell tower tall enough to peer down into the brothel courtyard, as if God were expected to keep watch. The irony was not lost on the women below. One anonymous note found in a brothel ledger reads, "We kneel more often than the monks, but for worse pay." Courtesans were a different class entirely, especially in Italian cities. These women cultivated education, charm, and poetry alongside sensual skill. They were companions to artists, politicians, philosophers. They attended salons. They wrote letters. They advised lovers on fashion and diplomacy. Some became famous in their own right. Veronica Franco of Venice, though slightly later in period, left behind poems, letters, and court records detailing her sharp wit and unrepentant pride. She was both celebrated and condemned, accused of witchcraft, defended by admirers, and never quite controlled. But for most, sex work was a cycle. Hard to enter, harder to escape. Some women saved enough to leave, opened shops, remarry. Others grew older and became keepers themselves. Some vanished, no record, no funeral, just silence. The archives are full of names that appear once in a tax ledger or court complaint, then disappear forever. Their stories lost, except for the margins where someone scrawled a note, good with song, had'll laugh like spring. Gone now. Clients, on the other hand, often returned to respectable lives. They confessed, paid penance, attended mass. Sometimes they even passed laws to regulate the very houses they once visited. One English lord was known to write moral tracts against prostitution, while maintaining a tab at 2 brothels. He paid late. 2. The hypocrisy was not hidden. It was simply ignored. Punishments for brothel workers were inconsistent. In times of plague or moral panic, cities might shut the houses down, drive out the women, and declare a return to virtue. A few years later, the houses reopened. Quietly, without fanfare. The economy always needed them. Morality, after all, was a seasonal crop. It blossomed in Lent and wilted by harvest. Still, the brothel remained a place of complexity. It was not simply sin. It was survival, a kind of negotiated intimacy, a theater of power, pain, and occasional tenderness. Some clients returned not for pleasure, but for conversation. A widow who had not been touched in years, a boy afraid of his new wife, a merchant facing death who simply wanted to be held. The women knew them all, knew how to listen, knew how to pretend, knew, sometimes, how to make it real. And so the brothel doors closed softly each night, the lamps dimmed, the coins were counted, the stories folded back into silence. Tomorrow the city would pretend again. The priests would preach. The men would swear virtue. The women would wait behind curtains. And the cycle would continue. Next, we step into the shadows of secrecy once more. Not for pleasure this time, but for fear. We enter the world of punishment, shame, and public spectacle, where lust met law, where the accused stood barefoot before judges, and where even onions were once used as evidence of moral decay. Step softly now into the hush of the birthing room, where the windows are shuttered and the air smells of damp straw and burning herbs. The candles burn low. The midwife nods knowingly, holding a spoonful of something bitter and unnamed. A woman moans softly behind a curtain. Somewhere outside, A priest is mumbling a prayer for safe delivery, but no one inside is listening. They're listening to the body instead. Because, in the medieval world, pregnancy was never a guarantee. It was a riddle. And to answer it, people turned not only to saints and science, but to everything in between: rituals, superstition, and secrets kept in whispered circles of women. Conception was a mystery, a dangerous, fascinating mystery. Most people knew the basics. Sort of. There was a general belief that both men and women contributed something sacred: blood, heat, or breath, but no one could quite agree on how it all worked. Aristotle had his theories, Galen had others. In some texts, the womb was described as a little furnace that needed stoking. In others, it was a greedy mouth, eager to swallow a man's essence. These weren't metaphors, they were taken seriously. Doctors copied diagrams by candlelight showing uteruses with teeth, because, of course, they did. Fertility was valued, especially in marriage. A child was a sign that the union was blessed, the bloodline secure. But when a child didn't come, questions arose. Was it the woman's fault? Almost always, yes. At least according to everyone with a beard and a quill. Perhaps her womb was too cold, or too dry, or tilted in the wrong direction. Some women were told to drink wine boiled with rabbit testicles. Others were instructed to hang herbs in their bedchambers. Rue, fennel, tansy, mugwort. Some lay on their backs with their feet in the air. Others prayed to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, who had once leaped from the belly of a dragon, and therefore clearly knew her way around tight situations. And when pregnancy did occur, it was celebrated, feared, and micromanaged. The woman was told what to eat. Not too much fish, no cabbage, plenty of milk, but not from a cow that had recently seen a weasel. She was advised to avoid strong emotions. No sudden fright, lest the baby be born trembling. No lustful dreams, or the child might be marked by sin. If she craved sweet things, it meant a girl. If sour, a boy. If she glowed, she was likely carrying twins, or perhaps just had gas. The line between folklore and medicine blurred completely. But not everyone wanted to conceive. And for those who preferred to avoid the consequences of a night too warm and two wine-soaked options existed, some older than history itself. Contraception was not a modern invention. It was just far more dangerous back then. Women drank teas brewed from pinereal, Queen Anne's lace, and wild carrot. They tucked bits of dried basil or wool soaked in vinegar high inside themselves. Some wore amulets, some whispered charms, a few even inserted beeswax as a kind of medieval diaphragm. Effectiveness varied. Most methods were more about hope than certainty. But people tried. Repeatedly. The Church condemned it all. Of course, to prevent life was to defy divine will. And so, most contraception happened in secret, passed woman to woman, never written down, unless a physician happened to overhear, or a court case required documentation. Some doctors mentioned pessaries in their texts, vague terms for things placed internally, but they always added a note of disapproval. Meanwhile, men often relied on withdrawal or post-coital prayer. Neither were particularly successful. When these methods failed, and a pregnancy arrived unwanted, desperate measures followed. Abortifacients, they were called. Herbal recipes meant to end a pregnancy. Some were taken as teas, others applied directly. Ingredients included rue, savin, juniper, tansy, and sometimes far darker things. Some women drank large quantities of wine and danced until they collapsed. Others beat themselves or sought blows to the belly. None of it was safe. Most of it was painful. And if caught, the punishment could be severe fines, exile, even death. But when the stakes were already high, many were willing to risk the rest. If the child was born, the rituals began. Birth was both miracle and terror. Many women died. Midwives were the true experts, though rarely given credit. They boiled water, wrapped hot stones in cloth to ease cramps, used birthing stools to let gravity assist. They rubbed oils on thighs, tied amulets around wrists. Some even whispered blessings in Latin, half remembered from church, twisted into charms. There were no epidurals, no antiseptics, no sterile gloves. Just experience. Just women helping women through the oldest doorway in the world. After the birth, taboos multiplied. A woman was considered unclean for a period 40 days for boys, 84 girls. She was not to enter a church, not to cook, not to speak certain words. A priest would eventually come and perform a ceremony called the churching, which was part blessing, part reacceptance. Until then, she rested, or tried to. Infants were swaddled tightly, believed to keep their limbs straight. They were baptized quickly, sometimes within hours, since infant mortality was high, and no one wanted a soul caught in limbo. Godparents were chosen carefully. A wealthy sponsor meant favors for life. A pious one meant insurance for heaven. Babies were named after saints, ancestors, or, occasionally, patrons. There's even a record of a girl named Lerda, after her mother claimed to dream of a goose the night before her birth. The priest refused to enter that in the parish book. She was baptized as Margaret instead. But when children failed to come, or were born still, the grief was immense and complicated. Women blamed themselves. Men blamed their wives. Families murmured about curses or secret sins. Some thought a witch had touched the bedpost. Others believed a midwife had said the wrong prayer. Miscarriages were rarely spoken of. They were wrapped in silence, in linen, in shame. But they happened often, and quietly. Behind closed doors, women mourned what they were never allowed to name. Still, life pressed on. Children arrived or didn't. The body continued its slow, mysterious dance. Knowledge remained imperfect, but people adapted. They read signs in the moon, in a woman's skin, in the cries of owls or the taste of morning milk. It was all connected, they believed. The body, the stars, the soul. And even when they had no clear answers, they never stopped asking the questions. Today, some of the herbal recipes survive, recorded in the margins of old medical texts. One manuscript lists over 20 ingredients for a womb comforter, none of which are legal now. Another details a pessary recipe, including goat fat, parsley, and the ashes of a dried mouse. Effectiveness, unconfirmed. Risk, significant. But they tell us something important. These people weren't ignorant. They were trying to understand, trying to control, trying, in the end, to survive. And perhaps that's the quiet truth beneath all the myths and errors. These were people living in a world that gave them very little control over their own bodies. So they whispered, they boiled roots, they listened to midwives instead of priests. They trusted the woman who had seen 30 births more than the man with a Latin book. And in doing so, they passed knowledge down, not always correct, but always human. Now, as the herbs hang drying from the rafters and the fire fades to embers, we step back into the larger world. The private became public again. Not in a tender way, but a spectacle. We turn next to scandal, to trials, to punishments that made intimacy into theatre. Because if desire could not be fully controlled, it could at least be shamed. And medieval Europe was very good at shaming. somewhere between the whisper of a confession and the scratch of a physician's quill. The body was mapped not in muscle or bone, but in sin. Not studied, but suspected. It was a vessel, they said, but also a trap, a temple and a temptation. The flesh hung heavy with warnings. Lust pulled it toward hell. Disease marked it with divine displeasure. Pleasure itself was treated like a wound that hadn't scalded. And yet, beneath robes and remedies, it pulsed on becusped. The body never cared what the theology said. It just wanted to move, to touch, to feel warm. Patterson did not separate the physical from the spiritual. Every illness, every tremor, every ache had meaning. If your legs trembled, perhaps your soul had stumbled too. If your skin flushed, maybe you had sinned in your dreams. Desire was not just a private thing. It was a public danger. It made cheeks red, eyes glassy, limbs restless, and for women especially, that restlessness was considered suspicious, dangerous even, because everyone knew a hot woman could bring down kingdoms. This wasn't just metaphor. It was medical theory. The doctrine of humors ruled everything. For fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, they had to be in balance, or the body suffered. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile, hot and dry. Black bile, cold and dry. If your humors got too warm, passion surged. Too cold, and you wilted like damp linen. Women were said to be naturally colder, softer, moister, which sounds vaguely flattering, until the physician declared that this made them weak, leaky, and overly prone to hysteria. The womb, they believed, could wander if neglected. It would slither up through the torso like a curious animal, searching for heat. If it reached the lungs, the woman might choke. If it reached the brain, madness. That there were cures, naturally. Most involved coaxing the womb back down with fragrant herbs or oils. Sometimes with wine-soaked sponges placed strategically. Sometimes with music. Yes, music. Apparently, a lute in the right key could settle the uterus. And if that failed, a midwife might simply massage the abdomen until the womb agreed to behave. Modern scholars raise their eyebrows at all this. Medieval doctors just wrote it down again and again. Because the uterus was not only a reproductive organ, it was an animal. And like any beast, it needed tending. For men, the body was simpler, still sinful, but more stable. The dangers came from excess. Too much lust, too much seed, and the body weakened. Too little, and it rotted from inside. So moderation was everything. Monks were warned about nocturnal emissions. Too many, and they might lose their strength or even their hair. Manuals listed ways to prevent them: cold beds, hard pillows, fasting. If the dreams still came, confession was required. But no one talked about the dreams themselves. Just the stains they left behind. Desire was always suspect. A flicker in the eyes, a flush in the chest. If a woman blushed in a man's presence, perhaps she was possessed. If a man lingered too long at the altar's edge, perhaps his mind had wandered to thighs rather than theology. Even doctors tread carefully. Touching a patient's body could lead to temptation. So they developed tools, tongue depressors, urine, flasks, and always a chaperone present when treating a woman. Preferably a nun. Preferably one who didn't smile. Urine was a favorite diagnostic tool. Physicians carried color charts: golden, straw, brown, bloody, cloudy. Each shade meant something. Pregnancy, infection, sign. Some physicians even tasted the urine to confirm their theories. Which sounds like commitment, or possibly just very poor boundaries. The urine of a lustful patient, they said, was restless. In its scent, as if desire could be bottled. In a way, it was. Leeches were used to bleed away excess, not just for headaches or fevers, but for lust. If a patient seemed too passionate, the doctor might recommend bloodletting to cool the body. Behind the ears, on the thighs, near the groin. Strategic locations, let the sin drain out with the blood. Other treatments included baths in herbs, like lavender or sage, or cold compresses, or abstinence. Always abstinence. Of course. There were aphrodisiacs too. Not officially approved, but widely whispered. Foods that heated the blood. Spices like cinnamon and clove. Honey mixed with ginger. The tongue of a blackbird boiled in wine. One recipe promised passion if consumed under the full moon by someone recently confessed. Another simply suggested eating leeks and hoping for the best. Onions, too, made frequent appearances. A roasted onion rubbed with lard and tucked beneath the bed could stir even the most reluctant partner. Or so the stories claimed. No one recorded whether it worked, probably because they were too embarrassed. Holy women walked a tightrope. Virginity was sacred. But too much piety, too much withdrawal from the world, could raise suspicion. Saints who fasted for months, who locked themselves in cells, who refused male company, they were admired, yes, but also feared. Were they holy or possessed? The line was thin. Some were examined by bishops, touched, questioned, diagnosed. If their bodies didn't decay after death, they were declared saints. If they did, perhaps it had all been a trick of pride. The same scrutiny fell on women who bled too much or didn't bleed at all. Menstruation was considered both cleansing and suspicious. If a woman failed to menstruate, her body was said to retain corruption. But if she bled too much, she was unclean. Either way, she needed help. A mixture of herbs, a prayer, a ritual. Some were told to sleep with a blessed candle beneath their pillow, others to avoid looking directly at the moon. The medical texts are filled with contradictions. Some claimed sex was healthy if done in moderation and within marriage. Others warned that every orgasm shortened the lifespan, that too much pleasure weakened the soul, that touching yourself even in dreams invited demons. A woman who touched herself was said to become infertile, mad, or both. A man who did the same might be cursed with blindness. Or so they said. Probably while doing it anyway. Doctors copied these theories from older texts. Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna added their own observations, often without any evidence. They were learned men, yes, but also deeply nervous about the idea that the body could act without the soul's permission, that it could want things not written in Scripture. So they wrote lists of symptoms, of treatments, of sins disguised as symptoms, and if the treatments didn't work, they blamed the patient. It's easy to laugh now at the leeches, the wandering womb, the music as medicine. But the deeper truth is quieter. These people were trying to understand themselves with the tools they had. They felt things they couldn't name. Hungers, fears, tremors in the gut, heat in the chest. They didn't have Freud, or estrogen, or antibiotics. So they built their logic out of moonlight and mustard seeds. And sometimes it worked. And sometimes it didn't. But always they tried. The sinful body was not just punished, it was protected too. Mothers wrapped their daughters in wool charms, husbands whispered over their wives' stomachs, nuns kissed each other's cheeks in the dark and said nothing. And somewhere, a midwife lifted a newborn to the light and muttered a prayer in a language older than Latin. Because, even if the body was a risk, it was also a gift. It was how people kissed, held, suffered, loved. Soon we come to the final doorway. The bed is made. The candles burn lower. But before we end, there is still one last story to tell. A quiet reflection on everything we've passed through, dire and danger, velvet and vinegar, confession and comfort. A closing of the curtain, and then, at last, a chance to rest. The last candle has almost burned down. Its wax has puddled into a sleepy spiral along the stone ledge. The pages have been turned, the curtains drawn, and here, at the edge of history's bed, we pause, not in shame or in laughter, but in something softer, a warm breath over the cooling coals of centuries. Because, for all the strange, forbidden, onion-scented, whispered rules of medieval sex, it always comes back to something very simple. They were people, and they wanted, just like we do. We've tiptoed through sacred bedrooms, through sanctified fear and vinegar-soaked wool. We've listened in on brothel ledgers and confession booths. We've followed physicians who thought your uterus might migrate up into your throat if it got bored. We've watched widows stitch their own chastity belts back together and midwives tuck charms behind babies' ears. And for every superstition there was a reason. For every punishment, a pattern. For every rule, someone breaking it in secret. And now we're here. At the end of it, the part where we get to breathe and wonder what it all meant. Not in an academic sense, not with footnotes and bibliographies, but with that hush that falls after the story is done and the fire still glows. Because beneath all the ink and incense, beneath the layers of linen and layers of law, medieval sexuality wasn't really about sex. Not entirely. It was about control, about fear, about hope, and about how to survive the feelings that wouldn't go away. Desire was a risk, always has been. For the church, it meant losing grip on souls. For husbands, it meant their wives might wander. For women, it meant their worth could vanish with one night of pleasure. For physicians, it meant a body that didn't obey the rules of humors. But even under all that threat, desire still found its cracks. Like ivy through a monastery wall, silent, persistent, unrepentant, there is something strange and beautiful in how hard they tried to explain it. The sins mapped out in lists. The diagrams of bodies that had never actually been seen. The purity tests that failed more often than they worked. The attempt to take something as ungovernable as attraction and nail it down with ink and doctrine. But even the best rulebooks left gaps. Even the most sacred bedsheets ended up wrinkled. We still see the remnants today. In our laws, our rituals, our whispers, the ways we talk about virginity like it's a trophy. The way we associate sex with danger, even when no one's watching. The way people still argue over who is allowed to feel what and when. We inherited their discomfort, their suspicion of touch, their obsession with proof. But we inherited their longing too, that quiet wish to be wanted, held, understood. For all their warnings and punishments, medieval people still loved, clumsily, secretly, deeply. They wrote poems to people they couldn't touch. They carved initials into chapel benches. They kissed behind herb gardens. They whispered confessions to nuns who said nothing. They told stories, sang songs, left behind smudged manuscripts with ink stains, right where the author hesitated. They buried lockets, pressed petals between psalm pages. Their longing was not always pure, but it was always human. And their bodies, those fragile, glorious, misunderstood bodies, told their own stories. In pregnancies that surprised everyone. In scars that no one explained. In bones bent from too much labor or too many children. In tendernesses that couldn't be written down. The body remembered what the pen was too afraid to say. What's strange is not how different they were. It's how much they weren't. We might laugh at their fears of garlic causing lust, or think ourselves clever for using words like autonomy and consent, but the struggle is the same. How to feel good without feeling wrong. How to love without fear. How to say yes and mean it. How to say no and be heard. Even the rules that seem so foreign, the forbidden days, the banned positions, the sign charts are echoes of our own impulses. Make a list, draw a boundary, define what's good, punish what scares us. There's comfort in clarity, but life, as always, refuses to stay inside the lines. And so they slipped between them. Not just the rebels and heretics, but the everyday souls. The baker's daughter who met her beloved at twilight. The monk who wept after touching someone's hand for too long. The wife who smiled at the apothecary and lied about needing more herbs. They didn't leave letters or sermons. They left a sigh in a dark room. A folded scrap of cloth. A look that lingered. They trusted the body to remember. In many ways, the medieval world was not designed for tenderness. It was cold. It was harsh. It judged quickly and forgave slowly. But tenderness found its way. It always does. In birth chambers lit with oil lamps. In the soft hush of shared beds. In the hands of a midwife who had seen too much death and still believed in gentleness. In the lovers who risked everything for one night and woke up still wanting. Their stories are quiet. They weren't recorded in royal chronicles or church registers. You have to look in the margins. In the fines paid for kissing. In the herbs sold by candlelight. In the beds that creaked during Lent. In the tears wiped away with someone else's sleeve. That's where the real history breathes. Not in parchment, but in the space between touch and silence. So here we are, at the edge of the past. The fire low, the body warm, and maybe now you see that medieval sexuality wasn't some distant, dusty oddity. It was just another way of being human. A complicated one, a flawed one, but one that held the same aching questions we still ask today. Am I allowed to want this? Will someone stay if I show them who I am? Can something be sacred even if no one blesses it? They answered those questions however they could. With ritual, with rosemary, with regret, with hope. And sometimes they got it wrong. But sometimes, just sometimes, they found something right. Inside the wrongness, a smile in a scandal, a touch behind a curtain. A kind of holiness that no priest would recognize. And maybe, after everything, that's what remains. Not the rules, not the shame, but the feeling of someone reaching out in the dark and not pulling back. That was the miracle. That was the truth they couldn't write but still lived. That sometimes, against the grain of all doctrine, people chose to love anyway. Thank you for walking through all of this. For stepping into the strange folds of history's bedsheets. For listening to the soft voices that were almost lost. For remembering that even the most confusing pasts are stitched with moments of human clarity. So now, as the night deepens and the parchment curls at the corners, let the quiet settle around you. You've made it to the end. The rules can rest. The candles can dim. And the body, ever stubborn, ever sacred, can simply lie still for a while. Close your eyes. The bells are not ringing. The priests are asleep. The streets are empty. There is nothing left to confess. Just breathe. Just rest. Good night.